So I'm standing in my own driveway, keys in hand, just trying to get to work, when this HOA officer storms up, demanding to search my car. I laughed at first, thought it was a joke. I mean, who even are you? Then, he reached for his belt. Yeah, he pulled a gun. Right there. Over nothing. What he didn't know. I'm not even a member of the HOA. I never signed up. I never agreed to be bound by their petty rules. And legally, that move just made him the villain of his own story. I could hardly believe what I was witnessing. My morning routine, usually quiet and uneventful, had abruptly turned into a scene out of an action movie. There I was standing on my asphalt driveway, looking directly into eyes that didn't yet understand the magnitude of their mistake. The officer's hand trembled just a bit as he held the weapon, his face a mix of authority and uncertainty. The absurdity of the situation struck me. Here was someone supposedly enforcing community standards for a group I'd never even joined, now brandishing a loaded gun at a private citizen simply because I refused an unwarranted search. That moment crystallized everything. It wasn't about security or safety. It was about power, about someone misusing their position to intimidate and control. And I wasn't going to take it lying down. In that split second, as the tension hung in the cool morning air, I realized that this confrontation was about to change everything. I'd spent years learning my rights, and now was the time to enforce them. The officer had just made the biggest mistake of his life without even realizing it. The moment that gun came out, the entire landscape of our community would shift, and I was at the center of that change. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and prepared to respond not with violence, but with the strength of truth and the clarity of the law. What followed would not only expose the overreach of a misguided enforcer, but also ignite a movement that would hold accountable anyone who abused power in the name of community standards. Today, in that moment, I decided that my voice, backed by undeniable legal rights, would drown out the baseless authority of an officer who had no business being there. Cedar Grove was the kind of upscale, gated community that prided itself on immaculate lawns, identical houses, and a rigid set of rules enforced by a local homeowners association, HOA. Every detail mattered here, from the exact height of the hedges to the uniformity of mailbox designs. The community operated under an unspoken pact of conformity, and deviations were met with swift, often heavy-handed, consequences. At the forefront of this enforcement was Officer Danielle "Danny" Simmons, one of the few figures the HOA entrusted to maintain order. Clad in a sharp uniform that blurred the lines between security and civil service, Officer Simmons was known for her strict interpretation of the rules. Some residents admired her for keeping the streets safe and orderly. Others whispered that she took her job a little too far. For reasons known only to the board, she wasn't an elected police officer in the traditional sense, but a contracted enforcer for the HOA, a position that gave her authority over members, or so the narrative went. But here's the kicker. I had never signed any agreement with the HOA. I lived on my own land at the very edge of Cedar Grove, where the rules didn't bind me. While most of my neighbors dutifully adhered to every mandate, I had always valued my independence and individual rights. My property, a modest home with a well-worn driveway, was a testament to self-reliance, a place where I maintained my own schedule, my own rules, and, as I soon discovered, my own rights under the law. I had built my routine around quiet mornings and a simple drive to work, until that fateful day when Officer Simmons, acting on orders I never consented to, burst into my personal space, demanding a car search. There I stood, perplexed and defiant, as she wielded her authority and, shockingly, a handgun to coerce me into compliance. The surreal mix of suburban normalcy and sudden, theatrical intimidation was jarring. My neighbors might have seen neatly trimmed hedges and identical front lawns, but what they didn't see was the price we all paid in freedom when an overzealous enforcer bullied a resident who had chosen to live by his own terms. I'd spent years learning about my legal rights and preparing for this eventuality, albeit never expecting it to unfold in such a dramatic fashion. My studies of property law and civil liberties had taught me that no one, not even a contractor of the HOA, could legally force a search on someone who wasn't a member. Yet here I was, taken aback by the audacity of an officer brandishing a gun and demanding compliance for rules that didn't even apply to me. This confrontation was not only about protecting my privacy, it was a stand against the systemic overreach that had long plagued communities like Cedar Grove. And as I prepared to defend my rights, I knew that the ramifications of this incident would extend far beyond my driveway. The stage was set for a showdown that would challenge the very foundations of HOA authority in our community, and I was ready to be the catalyst for change. The clash began with the officer's demand. In the heat of the moment, as I maintained my composure, I firmly refused the search. "I'm sorry, but I'm not a member of this association," I said, my voice calm yet resolute. The words hung heavy in the air. Officer Simmons' face contorted, first in confusion, then in cold fury. Before I could process her next move, her hand darted to her belt, and I saw the glint of metal as she drew her gun. That single action shattered any pretense of a routine encounter, marking the beginning of a confrontation that would send shockwaves throughout Cedar Grove. I immediately knew that this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an abuse of power. Over the following days, I began to document everything. I retrieved the security camera footage from my home system that recorded her arrival, noting every detail from her curt commands to the moment she brandished the weapon. I compiled logs of my correspondence with the HOA, as well as copies of local statutes that clearly delineated the limits of HOA authority. I reached out to legal experts who confirmed that, as a non-member, I was not subject to the HOA's enforced searches, no matter how vehement the complaint might be. News of the incident spread rapidly through both social media and neighborhood gossip. Neighbors who had long been wary of the HOA's rigid policies found new courage in my stand. Posts on local forums and Facebook groups exploded with support, many sharing their own frustrations about overzealous enforcement and arbitrary fines. Hashtags like #NotYourMember and #StandUpForRights began trending in our small community, galvanizing those who'd felt powerless against the HOA's intrusive practices. As the days passed, I attended a series of community meetings to speak out against the abuse of power. At one meeting held in the community center, several residents expressed shock that an officer, clad not in traditional law enforcement uniform, but as an extension of HOA authority, had resorted to such draconian measures over a simple refusal to allow a car search. "Who gives you the right?" one elderly man demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're not your subjects," another cried out. These public outbursts underscored a growing sense of outrage among the residents of Cedar Grove, where the lines between public service and private vendetta had become irreparably blurred. Determined to ensure that this incident would lead to meaningful change, I initiated contact with local civil liberties organizations. Through these channels, I gathered further support and legal validation that my rights had indeed been violated. The documentation was irrefutable. I distributed copies of my evidence to sympathetic journalists and posted detailed accounts on my blog. I also encouraged other non-members and even some HOA members to come forward with their own stories of undue interference. The movement swelled, and soon it became clear that my personal defiance was igniting a larger battle for civil rights within our community. Karen Baxter, whose name had become synonymous with the overreach of the HOA, found herself suddenly under intense scrutiny. Her previously unchallenged authority was crumbling as residents began questioning everything, from the legitimacy of her orders to the very existence of a rule that allowed her to conduct searches on non-members. As more evidence piled up and the public sentiment turned against arbitrary enforcement, whispers of reform began to circulate. The HOA board was forced to address not just my case, but a pattern of abuses that had long plagued Cedar Grove. By the time I knew the public hearing was scheduled, the digital dossier of evidence I had amassed had reached a critical mass. Neighbors rallied behind me, and online petitions demanding accountability and a review of HOA practices amassed thousands of signatures. It became clear that my refusal and the subsequent gun draw was not an isolated incident, but the spark that ignited a much-needed debate about individual rights versus overreaching authority. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation with the HOA, a showdown that would force every resident to reevaluate the balance of power in Cedar Grove. In the wake of the incident, the community reaction was explosive. Social media platforms buzzed with video clips of the confrontation, snippets of my defiant refusal, still frames of Officer Simmons' shocked expression as she brandished her gun, and caption images with hashtags like #NotYourMember and #HOBully. Neighbors who had silently endured the arbitrary dictates of the HOA now found their voices. Online forums, which had once been a quiet space for garden tips and recipe exchanges, erupted with outpourings of support and calls for accountability. Local news quickly picked up the story, and before long, reporters were seen outside Cedar Grove, interviewing both residents and legal experts. "It's unbelievable," one reporter commented during a live segment. An officer, acting under HOA orders, pulls a gun over a car search on a non-member's property. This isn't about safety. It's about power and who gets to enforce the rules. The narrative rapidly shifted from a minor infraction to a significant scandal that questioned the legitimacy of the entire HOA enforcement structure. Within the HOA board, the reverberations were keenly felt. Emergency meetings were held, and behind closed doors, a divide emerged. Long-standing board members, previously loyal to the rigid interpretation of the rules, began to question whether the existing policies were fair and just. Leaked meeting minutes revealed heated debates about the proper scope of authority and whether personal vendettas were being masked as civic duty. "This is not the community we signed up for," one board member was quoted as saying. "No one should have to live in fear of having their personal rights trampled by an overzealous enforcer." The internal conflict grew, and soon there were calls for a comprehensive review of the HOA's practices. I continued to update my digital platform with every piece of new evidence and every reaction from the community. I posted detailed articles, embedded video clips of the incident, and shared testimonials from neighbors who recounted similar instances where the HOA had overstepped its bounds. The digital petition I launched exploded in numbers, and soon, several local civil liberties groups offered to support legal action. The hashtags #NotYourMember and #StandUpForRights became rallying cries across Cedar Grove, uniting residents in a collective demand for reform. Karen Baxter, the face of the controversy, was forced to make public statements defending her actions. In a series of hastily recorded videos, she claimed that her actions were for the greater good and that the search was necessary to maintain community safety. But every time she spoke, her words were contradicted by the cold, hard facts laid out in the evidence. Experts in property law and local policing took to the airwaves, reminding viewers that no one had the right to search a vehicle on private property unless a valid, legal reason existed, a reason that was completely absent in my case. As the community's outcry grew louder, the pressure on the HOA board mounted to a breaking point. Neighbors organized protests outside the HOA office, brandishing signs that read "Our rights, our rules, and no more HOBully." Public forums and town hall meetings became the stage for impassioned debates on individual rights versus bureaucratic overreach. Every comment, every shared story further reinforced the message. If the HOA board did not address this abuse of power, then the culture of intimidation would continue to fester in Cedar Grove. The turning point was signaled by the announcement of a final public hearing, a decisive meeting that would determine the future of HOA enforcement in our community. In the days leading up to the hearing, I continued to galvanize support, compiling every shred of evidence into a comprehensive digital dossier. Influential local bloggers, community activists, and even a few sympathetic board members joined the chorus, urging the HOA to confront its practices. "This is our stand for freedom," one post read. "No one should be bullied by a group that claims to protect order while trampling on basic rights." By the time the final hearing was scheduled, the community was a maelstrom of anger and determination. The digital dossier reached every corner of Cedar Grove, and the unanimous sentiment was clear. The days of arbitrary enforcement and unchecked power were over. The stage was now set for a final, dramatic showdown. a moment when the community's unified voice would force the HOA board to choose between defending outdated, oppressive policies or embracing a future of fairness and respect for individual freedoms. The decisive moment arrived on a cool, brisk morning in a packed boardroom at the Cedar Grove Community Center. The room was filled with a sea of determined residents, local law enforcement representatives, concerned community leaders, and members of the HOA board, each person there to witness the final public hearing that would decide the fate of our community's enforcement policies. With an air of resolute calm, Councilwoman Teresa Nguyen stepped up to the podium, her eyes scanning the expectant crowd and reflecting the passion of a community that had long yearned for change. After an exhaustive review of all digital evidence, including time-stamped security footage, detailed property logs, and the heartfelt testimonies of our neighbors, we have reached a conclusion that leaves no room for doubt. Councilwoman Nguyen began, her voice steady and authoritative. It is abundantly clear that the actions taken by the HOA officer, who, under the banner of enforcing community standards, pulled a gun on a resident for simply refusing a car search on private property, were not only baseless but a gross abuse of power. I remind you all, this resident is not even a member of our HOA. He has never agreed to be part of this oppressive system, and his rights should never have been compromised. A heavy silence fell over the room as Nguyen continued. Effective immediately, the HOA board will rescind all sanctions related to this incident, and we will initiate a full disciplinary review of the practices that allowed such an abuse of power to occur. Furthermore, new guidelines will be implemented to protect the rights of every resident, ensuring that no one's private property is ever subject to such intimidation again. Today's decision is not just about one incident. It is a resounding declaration that Cedar Grove will no longer tolerate the misuse of authority to enforce arbitrary rules. Her words resonated powerfully, and a wave of approving murmurs swept through the assembly. At that moment, a respected community advocate, known for his indefatigable defense of individual rights, rose to speak. "Today, we stand together as one," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of years of suppressed frustration. "No resident should ever have to endure intimidation or have their right to privacy violated by an overzealous enforcer. Let this vote be the turning point, a clear signal that Cedar Grove values freedom and respect above all. We demand accountability, and we will not rest until every abuse of power is met with swift and just action." His declaration was met with thunderous applause, echoing through the boardroom. Following his address, a senior officer from the local Civil Liberties Office presented the final dossier, a meticulously compiled record of all digital evidence and expert analyses that confirmed the legality of the resident's position and the complete lack of jurisdiction held by the HOA officer. Every piece of evidence, from the time-stamped security footage to detailed legal opinions, exposed the unauthorized use of force and the blatant violation of civil rights. The Internal Affairs Panel had already unanimously endorsed strict disciplinary measures against those responsible, and the full report was scheduled for immediate public release. Councilwoman Nguyen concluded, "Let this resolution mark the dawn of a new era for Cedar Grove, a community where every resident's rights are inviolable and where the abuse of power will no longer be tolerated. Our vote today is a resounding declaration that we will protect our freedoms and that no one, no matter how self-assured, can impose their will on a free citizen. Together, we stand for justice, accountability, and the right to live without fear of arbitrary interference." Her final words, delivered with unwavering conviction, sealed the turning point in our collective battle for civil liberties. In that defining moment, as every face in the boardroom shone with determination and hope, the balance of power shifted irrevocably. The overwhelming digital evidence and the unified voice of our community forced the HOA board to take decisive action, a turning point that would forever reshape the governance of Cedar Grove. The days of intimidating, arbitrary enforcement were over, and a future built on respect for individual rights was finally within our grasp. In the weeks that followed the decisive public hearing, Cedar Grove underwent a profound transformation. News of the rescinded fines and the comprehensive reforms implemented by the HOA board spread swiftly throughout local media and on social networks, sparking passionate debates about civil liberties, community governance, and the inviolability of private property. Editorials in the local newspaper, with headlines such as "A New Dawn for Cedar Grove" and "Community United for Freedom," celebrated the bold action taken to protect our rights as individuals. Hashtags like hashtag stand up for rights, hashtag no more bullying, and hashtag freedom first trended widely, reinforcing our collective commitment to never again tolerate the misuse of authority. Town hall meetings and community forums saw unprecedented attendance. Residents gathered to share their own experiences of arbitrary enforcement and to envision a future where every citizen's rights were respected. Neighbors, who had long lived in fear of intrusive searches and punitive measures, now spoke openly and passionately about their right to live and work without interference. Our homes and properties are our sanctuaries, not battlegrounds for bureaucratic power plays, one impassioned speaker declared, his words resonating with the entire audience. The atmosphere was one of hope, unity, and the promise of lasting change, a renewal of the values that had once defined Cedar Grove. Within the reformed HOA board and local law enforcement, swift changes were implemented. Senior officials, led by Director James Carter and Lieutenant Marcus Reed, launched comprehensive training programs focused on ethical conduct, cultural sensitivity, and the responsible exercise of power. Regular internal audits and transparent disciplinary procedures were established to ensure that every complaint was thoroughly scrutinized and that no resident would ever again be subject to arbitrary infringement on their rights. Our duty is to ensure that every member of this community can live in freedom and security, Lieutenant Reed proclaimed in a follow-up press conference, reaffirming our renewed commitment to justice and accountability. Community leaders and local civil rights organizations mobilized as well. Workshops, public forums, and educational campaigns were organized to raise awareness about individual rights and the importance of holding those in power accountable. When we stand together, our voices become an unbreakable force for change, a local activist announced at a town hall meeting, inspiring residents to join in the fight for a more just and respectful governance system. For me, the journey from that shocking confrontation to the transformative resolution was deeply personal. My refusal to be intimidated by an overzealous HOA officer and my steadfast assertion of my legal rights as a non-member had not only reclaimed my personal freedom, but had ignited a community-wide movement. Neighbors, once silenced by fear, found their voices and began sharing stories of similar grievances. The digital evidence that exposed the unauthorized gun draw and the subsequent legal blunder became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the sanctity of private property and the right to live without fear of arbitrary searches. Karen Miller, whose name had become synonymous with oppressive enforcement, slowly faded from the conversation as the community rallied behind the principles of justice and individual freedom. Digital records of her past abuses were examined and widely discussed, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority. Her influence diminished as the people of Cedar Grove reclaimed their power. At a final celebratory event held in the Central Park of Cedar Grove, residents, local officials, and community advocates gathered under the golden glow of a setting sun. A large banner reading "Unity, Freedom, and Civil Rights" was unfurled between ancient oaks, and heartfelt speeches echoed promises of a brighter, more inclusive future. Today, we celebrate our victory over tyranny and arbitrary rule, a victory for every free citizen in our community, Councilwoman Nguyen proclaimed, her voice imbued with passion and determination. The standing ovation that followed was a powerful affirmation of our collective commitment to protecting our rights and ensuring that no one could ever abuse public power again. As each new day dawned over Cedar Grove, the legacy of that fateful encounter endured as a beacon of transformative change. The story of how an overzealous HOA officer's misguided action, pulling a gun on a resident who wasn't even a member, was exposed and overturned became a rallying cry for every resident who believed in the right to freedom and respect. Every sunrise now carried the promise that in Cedar Grove, truth, justice, and individual liberty would forever prevail. In the end, what began as a deeply personal confrontation evolved into a watershed moment for our entire community. We emerged more united, more vigilant, and more determined to safeguard our rights against any form of bureaucratic overreach. And as the sun rose each morning over our reclaimed neighborhood, it carried with it the promise that Cedar Grove would forever be a place where freedom, integrity, and respect for individual property and civil rights shone as brightly as the morning light.